Hey, Suuchi, welcome to the Alibaba.com Sourcing Insights podcast. How's it going today?
Good. Thank you for having me. I'm
Yeah,
excited.
absolutely. I think this is going to be a great conversation. We're going to really dig into companies trying to scale from around that $1 million mark to, let's say, $50 million, which can be a pretty crazy joyride. I've been on the $1 million to $10 million train, so I can give some insights from that perspective as we're talking. But it'll be fun to talk about growing even bigger. Before we get too far into this, though, I just wanted to give you an opportunity real quick just to introduce yourself and let people in the Alibaba.com audience here know who you are.
Yes, so I have a background academically and professionally in tech and supply chain analytics, so engineering and master's in computer science. And I am an immigrant. I came into the United States on my tech jobs. And through my career before Suuchi Inc., the common thread was supply chain analytics. So I started with Intel with their supply chain analytics team, and then went on to join two different venture-backed tech companies in the predictive data analytics and supply chain space. So I was fortunate to be working with a lot of companies that we were servicing, looking at their data, providing predictive models. And through that time, I saw that the supply chain tech landscape across these companies was pretty broken and disconnected. Companies were simultaneously operating across two ends of a continuum. So whether you were small and growing fast or really big, a big part of the business was running on Excel and Google Sheets. And then at the other extreme, there's still these monolithic ERPs, and connecting all these disconnected data sets and all the different participants was a challenge. So I just felt like there might be an opportunity to create a single source of truth and a supply chain platform that could spread across the length of the supply chain and provide a seat at the digital table for internal players as well as outside participants. So that's my background, and that's how I thought through that gave me the experience to think about the idea that became Suuchi Inc.
It's interesting you mentioned Excel sheets and this no man's land because I've been in this exact no man's land. It's like either Excel or NetSuite, and if you're not at the NetSuite level where you're willing to pay half a million, $1 million a year for software, you're on Excel and still running a multi-million-dollar business through Excel sheets. It's kind of almost hilarious at some level.
Yes, no, absolutely. And that's you hit the nail on the head. That's precisely the challenge we set out to solve. And as this podcast is about talking about companies scaling, and in that exact place that you describe, and there has to be a simpler solution to that because big part of scaling and having is having a successful backbone, which includes having a digital tech stack. So you shouldn't need to choose between Excel and a $500,000 solution on the other end. There has to be something in
Yeah.
between. And we'll talk about that some more. But I think that's a big consideration for companies is how do you figure out the right kind of sourcing solution as you scale, but also the right kind of digital solution as you scale that makes sense for where you are as a company without you needing to pay an arm and a leg for it if you are a company scaling fast.
So you mentioned, the software and tech stack infrastructure. What are like some other challenges you see as companies are scaling? Uh, I can think of a few, but let's kind of talk through some of them. That's some of the things that come up as you go, because it's a totally different world when you're sourcing $1 million worth of goods, bringing in maybe 3 or 4 containers a year, whatever it might be, versus being a $50 million company and having multiple containers on boats at all times and sourcing maybe from all over the world. There's quite a bit of difference, and I went to the school of hard knocks. I learned a lot of this the hard way along the way. I think the idea here is to talk through some of these things on the podcast here and give people some insights and things to be thinking about as they're growing their business. So, what are some of those things that you've seen?
So many, and you could bucket them as the
Right.
problems, but if you're in it, you're in the weeds, and they're definitely big problems. I, it, like you said, there are quite a few of those, but let's try and list them. One of them is spreading your execution risks. And what I mean by that is when you start scaling, most often companies have all their eggs in this one
Yep.
basket, where they're probably working with one factory or a couple of factories in the same geo. And that opens up a lot of risks. One risk is, of course, you have these macroeconomic changes, and we're in the middle of some of that, and suddenly these companies are stuck because goods are not coming to you, and even if goods are coming to you, the costs are escalating. So you want to be ahead of that and preempt those situations. And even if it's not a black swan event, it just is smart to start diversifying your supplier base and be spread across the world. And when we often talk about having a presence in in both sides of the world, and a lot of companies mistake this advice to mean, oh, I should just move everything from the Far East here to the Western Hemisphere, and that's really not the
Yeah.
answer. It's about having a spread so you can get the best of all worlds. So I'd say that's one challenge.
So I love this train of thought because this is something, maybe I'll learn something here because this is something I've been struggling with myself quite a bit. Obviously, we source quite a bit of stuff from Asia. We source other parts of the world as well. We're just not quite at the volume, it feels like, to be able to source in multiple places. The challenges I tend to find is like the place that we went to source from the begin with is the cheapest option. You know, a lot of places in the world geographically tend to be the best for whatever it is. They're really good at making injection molded plastic, for instance. Another place in the world might be really good at sewing stuff. And so, what level do you need to be at before it does make sense to start sourcing from more than one manufacturer? And what is the approach? I mean, is there some type of insurance hedge here where like you are paying more to do it from one manufacturer versus the other, but like you're also spreading your risk? I mean, what's the approach there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and there's two parts to that question, right? At what level do you need to be to start spreading? And I'd say the earlier the better. And you, as one of the team members driving the growth of a team, you're going to know when you're at that cusp of really exploding in a good way. So you want to almost be a little bit ahead of that and preempt that and start, because these conversations to set up base in different countries take some time. And you're right. I mean, we see with the companies you work with as customers that how do you, if so you make that decision that you want to spread, but how do you attract the interest on the other side, from the supplier side or the factory side, because you might not have that volume? And the answer is you want to work with experts that know and can aggregate volume, meaning there might be these intermediaries that understand the cultural nuances and have the relationships. And we've seen that relationships are so key when you're trying to open up to a new supplier base. So that's one part of it. And they're also able to, to the earlier point, aggregate volume from perhaps some of their other customers as well, right? So you definitely want to do that. But I'd encourage companies to do that sooner rather than later and not wait. And the second part of that question you raised was one of costs. I think a lot of companies take a short view of how they view cost, which is it's not just the cost of goods sold, it's also the opportunity cost of lost sales, as well as the cost of freight, which we've seen wildly fluctuates. And so that's the beauty of having a presence, not just in the Far East, but somewhere closer, somewhere in Central South America. If, for example, you're an American brand, is when you get something in a little bit of a higher volume from the Far East, there's a huge benefit to that, of course. But when you get relatively shorter, smaller runs from, say, South America, you have the advantage of not needing to hold huge amounts of inventory, but you're probably also paying less in freight, and you've been able to capitalize on demand and
Yeah.
not lose sales. So that's another way of looking at it, is you might want to have your own back of the envelope Excel formula for how you truly calculate cost of goods sold and then the opportunity
Yeah, it's
cost of
that true
lost
landed
sales.
cost because
I think the
you know
art
there's like
here,
you said there's a whole bunch, but besides the opportunity cost and the time cost of money and losing those sales, the damage that does to your brand, the fact that there's probably someone else out there waited with bated breath to capture those sales if you're not there with the product available. But you mentioned some other things here that's really important: the cost of freight. There's time cost of money of point to point from the time you place your order to the time it shows up at your door. The freight transit times from Central or South America can be less. There's also the duties aspect where we're not in a trade war in the United States with South America or Central America, it seems, and so we tend to look at that true landed cost all the way through. And one of the things that is really important that you also brought up there is just that opportunity cost. I mean, you just never know who else is waiting in the wings to capture those sales, and you lose that customer forever potentially.
yeah, no, 100%. And that's the thing about macroeconomics, is those are items, those are just factors and parameters that are out of control. And so in many ways, you're controlling more for those out of control factors by diversifying your supplier base a little bit. So you can optimize with just having the best combination of goods in terms of time, costs, as well as these macroeconomics, that it's just inevitable that they're going to hit you, given that
Yeah, and
supply
it's
chains are
also
global.
inevitable that no matter how long you've been working with a supplier and how good a relationship is, things change. I mean, either they get some other really big order and you become small potatoes and they can't service you anymore, or your volume grows and they can't deal with keeping up with that volume. They decide they want to take advantage of you in some way and start raising pricing, or their quality slips. There's all kinds of things that can happen. It's really just a matter of time. And so being able to diversify in the way that you're talking about really makes it easy to almost flip a switch and move manufacturing to that other manufacturing versus, I mean, think about how long it takes you to set up a brand new relationship, and trying to do that at the worst possible time is never the time to be doing that.
Yes, no, you never want to be initiating a new
Yeah.
relationship under duress, uh, because you're then in a lose-lose situation. Is you're under stress with your existing relationship because you're beholden to them, and then you're also not in the best place to negotiate a new relationship. The other angle to this is beyond the fact that you want to have a good percentage spread across different suppliers. It's also about growing. It's also about growth. If you think about growing your brand, you want to be launching new categories. And so when you think about dual sourcing, one is, can I take my most successful products and have different sources for it, which is important. But the second is there might just be different suppliers and different geos that are good for new
Yeah.
products that you may want to launch. So it's also investing in
And one of
growth
the
in
things you're
new
talking about bringing
categories.
up geo, I mean, hopefully your brand's not just expanding in the United States only. Hopefully you're selling in other parts of the world. And so these other manufacturers might be able to save you money shipping into the UK, for instance, or into the Eurozone, or wherever other marketplaces, Australia, maybe India, things of this nature. So again, it's a complex uh, picture. It's not just a one single facet you want to be looking at. Like, just what is the price you're charging me for the widget? Because there's so much more to it than that.
Yes, yeah, no, 100%. And I think a lot of companies don't realize that, with growth, they could grow quickly, but they could also grow in a very complex way, in a good way, meaning go across different countries and being prepared for that. And I know that wasn't part of your question, but I think as they do that, it's also preparation on how do you digitize as you grow. Because one part is diversifying your risks with having different suppliers, but also diversifying risks and having as much as you can be digitized. Is it's difficult to understand the success of your supply chain or where your risk factors are, without truly having the data to analyze it in retrospect. And I think a lot of folks, to your point earlier, you don't need a system that costs you half a
Yeah.
million dollars to be able to assess that. Just start with the basic principles where you're able to accumulate all of the data in one place, but also have all the participants interact in some meaningful way where it's not manual, where it's not asynchronous. You have everything in one place. And so the important thing for a lot of companies scaling fast is you have to have the ability to take a step back, take a look at your historical performance, and derive some smarts and intelligence out of it to be able to then make the right decisions about the future as you scale. So that's another important part of it too. And I think the beauty about some of the systems that the new generation of supply chain platforms, including ours too, the Suuchi Grid, is we provide an interface where suppliers can interact, and so brands have the ability to invite their suppliers so they could participate in the conversation, have a seat at the digital table, and you then have ways to assign tasks and projects and dates. So if you're adding suppliers to your global supply chain, it's now possible to go back in time and look at the last year and see how somebody did, what was their cost, what was the margin you made by supplier, how long did it take, and then just some of those basic metrics. Then it informs the decisions you
So
would
what
make in
are
the
some of the
future.
things? Because I mean, we're still. Well, I shouldn't say still. We've gone back to Excel. It's so funny as we were talking about this conversation. And you mentioned some of the things. I mean, having some historical data, but I'd love to dig in a little bit more of what can someone do as they're scaling. What does this data provide them? Like, what actionable cost savings are they getting, or improvements in their supply chain in terms of timeline, or not running out of stock? What does the data like specifically do to help with those types of issues?
Well, it depends on, I mean, it starts by listing what the top business challenges are today for a brand, as well as what are the objectives and goals you're trying to achieve. But to specify one common thing we see is as brands scale, there's a lot of manual tasks, and then you're really hiring people to complete those manual tasks. And the right way to look at it is you don't want to add people to chip away at those problems. You ideally want to digitize that, so the team members are really focusing their time on more of the strategic tasks to grow the company. So take an example of that is, one of our customers, before they brought our system in, manually, adding data on all of the purchase orders and sending it to the suppliers, and then calling the suppliers on WhatsApp or phone calls, and then sending emails to them, and then waiting for the suppliers to acknowledge the purchase orders. And then across the production tracking process, all of the updates on dates and files are all happening manually as well over phone calls. So there's no accountability really on when things are delayed, or if things are delayed, what's the downstream impact of delivery to the customers. So when all of this information is not cataloged and is entered manually, it could be the full-time job for a bunch of people as a company scales. Plus, you really don't have a handle on if something goes wrong or something is missed, what's the downstream impact. So both of those are some of the fundamental low-hanging fruit items that you can upgrade once you have a system where, number one, if you can automate the creation of purchase orders and just make it even faster, right? But it's a little bit faster to create POs, make assignments to vendors, have the vendors acknowledge it. So that's number one, is if you can even save 15 to 20% of a team member's time, and that's happening across 3 or 4 folks, then and then you annualize
Yeah.
that could be pretty good savings. And then those folks are more reallocating their time on more strategic imperatives. And then the second thing is, things are bound to go wrong in supply chain. Something's always going to go wrong. Things are never flawless and smooth. So it's just about having a system where, if you have simple rules built in, and now where everybody's participating, you have your whole production process tracked. If the cutting and sewing of something is delayed, now with simple formulas, you know what the downstream impact is, and you can control for it and take action in advance. So I'd say those are some of the challenges on the ground level, and having a system where you're
Yeah, I'll throw
digitizing can
one
help
more in here.
solve
You're
for some of
talking
that.
about a lot of manual labor, people having to do this. I don't know about you. I'm human as well, and I tend to make mistakes every now and then. And systems can definitely help with that as well. I mean, unfortunately, we've been victim to this, or just and we don't really yell at our staff or get too down on them for if they're making one mistake out of 1,000 things or whatever. We all make mistakes, but man, sometimes they cost us a lot of money, and they don't pay that back out of their salary to be like, oh, I made a mistake. I'll give you this $50,000 I just lost because you ran out of stock on something. And so having systems can really, I think, help with that as well. Just reduce any type of human error.
Yes, for sure. The human error is a big part of it. It's also accountability. Is if someone's making a mistake, of course you're talking about holding somebody accountable, but it's also going back and looking at what caused the mistake, and quantifying how much that cost you, so to prevent that going forward. That's the other thing systems can do. But again, in saying that, let's also say systems are not the magic answer to things. It takes some effort to implement something that works for you. So there has to be a commitment and a concerted effort to want to digitize and spend that time up front to make sure that systems are successful, because in many ways the ROI of these system implementations is also equally dependent not just on the right choice of software, but on the teams themselves, and making sure that they're setting it up and using it to maximize
Absolutely.
the return on
All
the
right, so we
investment.
talked about sourcing from multiple factories and hopefully multiple geos. We talked about systems. Let's do one more challenge that people face as they're scaling, and things that you can do to help with that as you're going through that process.
I'd say that we've seen a lot of companies spread themselves too thin. And I'll tell you what I mean by that is, a lot of the brands that we encounter, they grow successfully because they're experts at sales and marketing, or marketing their brand. And sometimes when you have explosive growth, it's just very easy to get distracted by focusing on the wrong strategy for your growth of the business. So to be very specific, we've seen some companies try to go establish supplier relationships in a new country all by themselves. And this is very, very common. And they may give up very early. So just as an example, if you want to set up in South America, the cultural nuances there are very different. Setting up terms, simple things like terms there it's much more dependent on relationships that you might have. So that's one example where recognizing and being authentic and intellectually honest about who you are as a company. What's made you successful is the branding and the actual product, and and rather going through experts and not wasting the time and effort on that. That's one example. The other is we've seen brands try to build their own IT systems in-house and spend the money on that. And then it takes them years before they realize they want to cut their losses and actually get somebody in. So there's a plus and a minus there. The positive is there is a recognition that they need to digitize, but they get a little too ambitious and try to build that in-house. So I'd say that's one thing, is taking a step back and being intellectually honest on what's really brought them to that point, and continuing to over-index on that and grow on that vector, which is the expertise in sales and marketing. But then being smart about saying, for everything else that's important, which is the backbone that's going to help me scale, let me find the experts that could go
It's
that,
funny.
that could do that. Versus
If you're watching
building
this
it
on video,
in-house.
you'll know I'm kind of laughing because I think if you give any entrepreneur enough time, they will convince themselves that they can build some type of system themselves, and it can't be that difficult. You just hire a developer, and it'll be done in no time. And I even have an IT background. That was my background before this, so I even have more confidence that I can make these types of things happen. And the reality is that someone else has spent hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars and a lot of time to like develop these systems, and probably can do it a lot better than you can.
Well, I mean, even if you could do it well, it's a whole
Yeah.
different business. You can only, as an entrepreneur, and I think we all fall down a few times and learn it the hard way, like you said, is even if you could do it well, you can't manage multiple businesses at the same time. And I think when you're growing as a brand, scaling and just making sure your supply meets demand and vice versa is a full-time job in and of itself. And so you don't want to simultaneously be a sourcing company as well as a software
Yeah,
company.
absolutely.
You can't build that all at the
So I
same
want to
time.
switch gears a little bit here because I think you might have some good insight here. As someone that's helping people source all over the world, millions and millions of dollars of goods. It's been, at least for me, the most challenging year or two of e-commerce. I mean, just the whole sourcing and logistics supply chain has been just so aggravating and just such a struggle. But a lot of times, opportunity is born out of these types of things. And so I'm wondering if now that you look back at it a year, almost maybe two removed from the start of this kind of nightmarish scenario, if you actually see opportunities emerging because of some of the fallout from those.
Yes, and we've seen that, written about so much. It's been inspiring and quite insane in a good way to see all the folks that converted the challenges and had that be tailwinds that helped propel their growth. At the cost of repeating myself, it's the dual sourcing strategy. Those that were already set
Yeah.
up in different parts of the world obviously were at an advantage, versus trying to scramble and build new relationships when excuse the language, when the shit hit the fan, right? Since you're always under duress, you don't want to do it at that point. So that definitely helped. I think those that had the ability to be nimble and get into new categories, because there were some categories that you don't have to go far away from what your brand ethos is. But there were some categories that did really well in the pandemic: athleisure, and just basic soft goods in terms of safety products, for protection, and so the being able to pivot and also using your nearshore capacity to do that was helpful. The third, but definitely I'd say the most important, was being able to also adopt technology in the tech stack, not just for the supply chain, but also to adapt to the new way of work. So we saw a lot of companies that previously were fully a lot of our customers, apparel companies, didn't even know what remote work was, and then they had to overnight go from being in the offices every day to working entirely remote. Many of them have stayed remote. And so adapting to that method of work and having the technology for that, will also plugging in the supply chain activity and the digital stream of that into the way of their work. And some companies were able to do that and some were not. But those that had the kind of leadership and the innovative leadership to take that step, definitely were well ahead. And that chasm between those that were able to adapt and those that were not further help those that were able to adapt, right? So they were able to capitalize on that gap and make that gap even wider, I think. So you're right. I mean, it's been inspiring to see some customers really come ahead
Yeah, very cool.
use the challenge and
All
convert
right,
that to
so
an
again, switching
opportunity.
gears just a little bit more. Again, we already talked about this a little bit, but I'm curious. It sounds like you're an expert at this. You're just kind of digital sourcing concept. Again, using software and tools for like the mid company. It sounds like the company that's outgrown the Excel sheet, but not ready to graduate to NetSuite yet. What are some things that you found that using digital can help identify suppliers? I mean, is there? I know some of our suppliers. If I was to try to bring them some of this technology components, that they would just be overwhelmed because they're just smaller factories that. And I visited some of them. It's kind of funny as you visit back when we could go visit. You think you're working with the biggest factory in the world, and you go realize you're like working out of someone's kind of garage and or whatever almost. But what are some strategies in terms of sourcing? I mean, obviously, Alibaba.com is like awesome for this, being able to use their platform to like help identify suppliers. But what are other opportunities that you've seen where you can use software to help identify suppliers and work with them as efficiently as possible?
Yeah, I mean, there's platforms, obviously, uh, Alibaba.com and our platform, and there's other platforms out there that either help you onboard your own suppliers or have a notion of suppliers that you could choose from. It I'd say the one thing we've seen that separates the successful platforms that you could find and work with suppliers on versus the ones that don't are the user interface. You can escape the fact that there's a big cultural transition point, and a lot of suppliers are not used to being on systems. They still prefer to work with the old methods, and email or a phone call is still the way to do it. So you'd have to understand that profile and that character set of that supplier base when you think about systems for them. So building, and I'll take some very specific examples, is having a very simple user interface, language translation in there so it's easy for them to use. But also, how do you onboard somebody that's this kind of a skill set? Meaning, with some platforms, you could give them simple links and ease them into that transition of needing to input information or providing approvals and acknowledgements. And a simple link could do that, versus if you need to forcibly onboard them, that might not work. So so the platforms that are successful, you want to give them a stepwise
Mm.
transition point to using the system versus making it binary and expecting them to use the system like a corporate user would. So if you're looking at digitizing the interaction with the supplier and doing it through a platform, I would urge brand decision makers to really look for platforms that over-index and really value the user experience and the user interface and have built that from the ground up for how suppliers would use it. Because if you could work with a platform that is very friendly to supplier use, it's done a lot of the homework for you already, versus you then making an independent decision on a software system and then
Yeah, it
separately
makes a lot of
working
sense.
with a supplier and
Have
trying
you
to force
ever
them on
actually
board.
had anyone that couldn't make the leap? That you were like onboarding new clients and working with trying to get suppliers kind of more into the digital realm. Has there been anyone that's ultimately given pushback, or is everyone kind of eventually kind of assimilated into the new model? The supplier specifically, yeah. Exactly,
You're talking
yeah.
about the supplier specifically within the ecosystem, yeah. Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, look, if you'd probably relate to this yourself, you're probably working with suppliers yourself for your supply chain.
Yeah.
It's not, you're never going to have 100% compliance, and it's very easy it's very important that you walk in when you do an implementation to be aware of that and have realistic expectations. So if you have, let's say, 10 suppliers, and if you're a company that's in that, and I'm taking averages based on actual data, but if you're in the 10 to $20 million range, you probably have 10 suppliers, and not all of them may be finished goods. Some of them may be your raw material suppliers, and you're going to expect that your top two suppliers that
Yeah.
do 50 to 70% of your work, that's going to be an easier sell because they value your volume, so it's an easier conversation to have with them to get on the system. And then we always recommend that you phase in the longer tail of suppliers that maybe you don't give that much volume to, because the leverage there a little less. You have less leverage in terms of the volume you're giving them. It directly corresponds to maybe having a tougher conversation to get them onboarded. And perhaps you don't need to have all the suppliers in the long tail on the system in any case, right? Because even if they're not on, the cost of interacting with them the way you were doing in the old world is maybe not hurting you as much, just because you're not giving them as much volume. So it's important to break up and cohort your suppliers. And when I say cohort your suppliers, it also means the new suppliers you bring
Right.
on, it's also easier to have that conversation up front with them and say that the newer cohort, I'm going to get them on because I'm going to establish with them that this is just the way we're doing business, and that's easier. And versus the ones in the past, pick the ones that are the most important to you, focus your efforts there because that'll have the most impact. And so expecting 100% compliance from 100% of your suppliers is not
Yeah.
realistic, and maybe
Makes
that's
sense.
okay.
Absolutely.
It's not necessary to have them all
Well,
onboarded.
Suchi, I can't thank you enough for your time. It's been like a really great conversation. I want to be respectful of your time and make sure we're not using up too much time. But before we wrap things up, I love asking like open-ended questions kind of at the end for things that I might have missed or not thought to ask. What are some tips that you might have, final tips here, and we can take as much time as you want to for companies that are kind of in this range of, again, they're maybe doing $1 million, you're looking to get to 50 million, some things that we haven't discussed so far today that are just come up over and over again, and you might have some insights, some tips on how to approach that before we wrap up here.
Yeah, I'd say, we spoke about technology and we spoke about hiring, and sometimes technology could help you be smart about how you hire. But I'd say when you go back to hiring, is look for diversity in the team you hire, and definitely bring folks from outside the traditional. If you are let's take the example of apparel. If you're an apparel brand, look for technologists that maybe just come from a very different industry for your next level of leadership, and come in with a fresh set of eyes, and they're able to challenge how things are done. Because investing in strategic thinking as you scale, and having the kind of people that could challenge you, and sometimes bringing somebody from an industry that's not yours, it can be very helpful. So, and I've seen that in the case of Suuchi Inc., but also with a lot of the customers, is the experience level of the executives you bring on is very important. So I'd urge that is invest in technologists. It makes a very big difference to the success of the brand. The second thing is to just always be talking with and staying in touch with technology players. It's because investing in the right systems can make all the difference, and versus making a decision, and you don't want to be just starting to experiment with these conversations 10 days before you want to make a purchase. Just almost making it a regular part of your day job, and always just staying connected with the different software systems out there is just healthy anyway, because it's informing you, you're learning. But then when the time comes and you want to make a purchase,
Awesome.
it just makes the
Again,
job
Suchi,
easier.
can't thank
So
you
those
enough
are
for your
those are a
time.
couple of
Thanks for
things.
coming on and talking to us on the Alibaba.com Sourcing Insights podcast. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did, and good luck to you the rest of the year.
Same. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.